All right, welcome race fans. We are live for the Austrian GP show and fantasy strategy discussion. Austria is one of the oldest races on the F1 calendar, first contended in 1964, and over the years has been held at three separate circuits. Max Verstappen has won here four times, and in 2020, if everybody remembers, the Austrian GP was Lando Norris's first podium. Given McLaren and Lando's recent pace, I think we're all going to be watching closely this weekend to see if Lando can take away Max's potential fifth win at this weekend's race. Before we get into the details and Q&A, so quick introductions. My name is Ross. I'm the founder and CEO of GridRival. With me today I have Michael Ursinoli, our CTO, Ryan Booth, president of Logan Sergeant Fan Club and our director of business operations, and the increasingly famous William Laddie, our principal software engineer. Reminder before we get going to like and subscribe to the channel to make sure you don't miss out on future shows and get all the alerts about everything that we do here on YouTube. And as a reminder too, if you've played any of our paid games, live in the US and any of the about 27 states they're live, we'd love to talk to you and learn about how you're enjoying them, what you're liking, what you're not liking. Feel free to reach out to us at support@gridrival.com. Kicking things off as a quick recap of the Spanish GP, going over some winners and losers in terms of salary fluctuation. It was I feel like last weekend was a pretty tame race if you look at the numbers, meaning there just wasn't as much up and down movement in terms of just total outright like fluctuation amount. So in the winner category, there's only one that stayed flat. So Sainz stayed flat last week. We had 11 drivers go down in value, 8 go up in value. Biggest winner last week was Gasly at 2 million. So some things to talk about here a little bit later in terms of the Alpine team and if we think they might be making a little bit of a comeback here. Hamilton up 1.7. Gasly's teammate Ocon up 1.2. Those are the only three biggest movers over $1 million. Everybody else, Verstappen, Norris, Russell, Hulkenberg, Guan Yu Zhou, all with smaller salary increases between about $0.5 and $1 million. On the team side, you have Mercedes up 1.7, Alpine up 1.1, and then Red Bull, Haas, and Kick all had small increases. Again, under $1 million. And then on the losing side, similar story. Only had one driver with a full price drop, which was Yuki, down $2 million. Albon down 1.5. Stroll on the ever famous stroller coaster, down 1.4 million. Alonso down 1.2 and within 100K of talent driver range. I feel like Alonso's been teasing us with getting close to that talent driver range a couple times this season. And then you have Leclerc, Piastri, Perez, Ricciardo, Bottas, Magnussen, and of course, Sargent on the drop list, all between about 3 and 900K. RB, the only notable constructor, dropped 2.2 million. I think there was a couple others, maybe 3, that had much less substantial drops. So I think more of a tame race in terms of salary fluctuation. Will Austria be the same? That is what we're here to discuss. So keep your questions coming if you have them. We're here to do Q&A, and we'll get to them as we get through some of our commentary. We're going to start by talking about who we think is undervalued going into this race. I will kick off the discussion with a question about Perez. Is now the time to sign Perez? I think we talked about it last week. He came in with a grid penalty. He's in a Red Bull car. It can kind of be attractive. You're like, man, he might be way undervalued. He's in the same car as Max, right? But is he in a downward spiral? Is he going to flatten out? Is he going to go back up in value? What do you guys think?
I said shaking
his head, I think.
Oh. William, you want to go?
Yeah, I'm not touching Perez right now. I would say that he's ranked 8th right now in terms of value. That's about right. I think it's a waste of a championship-winning car. I guess there's upside. Like, he could theoretically get himself together and get on the podium, but yeah, like that said, like, we don't see any mistakes to where like he's crashing out. So like I don't think he's going to fall much further than 8th. But like he's like barely a points driver, and Yeah, I'm not touching that. And I think I'm on record as saying extending Checo has cost Red Bull the 2025 Constructors title. And it might cost them the championship this year if Piastri could pick up the pace on the McLaren side. Uh, yeah, so I'm not optimistic about Checo.
All right, so
I'm
strong
probably not
opinions from
dropping
William.
him. Just to answer a question real quick, I'm probably not dropping him if I have him for one more race, especially with this being a sprint weekend. Locked down on Friday, by the way, guys and
Oh,
girls.
good reminder.
Yeah, so driver points will be a bit more important than constructor points. If you're going to drop Checo, you got to tell me what you're doing instead, because I'm not picking him up though, but I'm not necessarily dropping him for one race left either.
Ryan.
I'll give a little. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I'm ruining the flow.
Yeah. I mean, I said last week, hold off for one more race because of the grid penalty. I'm pulling the trigger on Checo. I think this is his spot. I think he's at a good value, 22 million. This is more of a play on the car than it is on Checo, and just hoping that Checo can be okay. He should finish top 6. I mean, he should finish better than that, but the floor should be top 6. I know it's not because it's still Perez, but I think this is just too good to pass up. And I'm just going to stick to my guns from last week. Maybe one of the few takes that will be correct from the show I did last week, because about everything else was wrong. So I hope you guys did not follow some of that advice, but I will be going with Perez.
Yeah. I would say if you have an empty spot and you're looking to spend that kind of money, Perez could just be a place to park money to hopefully not lose too much. Like to echo Williams' point, 8th is probably about right. So for like the cost for the amount of points, it is kind of there. I think a bunch of players will be considering Checo this week for league adoption, because if you remember a few races ago, the Piastri hype kind of peaked, right? So then Piastri was signed for 2, 3, 4 races. Piastri is going to be on one race lockout for a lot of players right now. So I could see players going for Checo because they're on the one race lockout, especially for Piastri or maybe even a Hamilton. But if you could afford Hamilton over Perez, I would go Hamilton over Perez, just from the potential for more points and more value. Granted, Hamilton had one good race right now, so we just got to see how that checks out. But there's only about a $2 million price difference, so you could afford Hamilton. I'm probably going to stretch to Hamilton. But yeah, I think we're going to see higher league adoption for Checo this week.
I would agree. I took my risk on him last week, so I have a couple more races to.
We told Ryan and I told you wait a race.
I know, man. You got to be a contrarian sometimes to win this game. You know that. Okay. Next discussion point on my list. Gasly finished 7th last weekend. Can we expect a turnaround from the Alpine team? They flattened out the last couple of races, and then this race, they both, like I said earlier, Gasly up 2 million, Ocon up 1.2. As a team, Alpine went up 1.1 million. So can we expect continued performance like that? In other words, I guess thinking of it in terms of directly in our game, Gasly is now the highest value driver under talent driver threshold. Is he somebody you guys would be recommending to add to your teams in terms of either points or value or both?
I won the league last week, and that was with a Ocon, Gasly, Alpine lineup, which yeah. So I have all three. I have all three right now. It is bold. Sometimes you have to make bold moves to make big points. And I went from 3rd to 2nd, and I'm almost touching 1st now again, after I dropped from 1st to 3rd. So I am watching Alpine very, very closely. The Austria racetrack's very different. They've been swapping chassis back and forth. But I will say I ran Ocon as a talent driver over Gasly. And I still think that was the safer move. So anyone who's considering Alpine, they're both talent driver eligible. Ocon and Gasly, I consider them kind of interchangeable, but I feel like there's a little less risk on Ocon just because he's a little bit less money, even though he's very crash happy. But it's also, we're talking about Alpine here, so there's a little bit of inherent risk with any selection within the Alpine realm. But yeah, I am planning on keeping, as of right now, until something happens dramatically in practice that makes me change my mind. I'm keeping Gasly and Ocon on my lineup and running talent driver for one of them. And I will say to probably be Ocon again, based on nothing.
I would for sure be running Ocon as talent driver this week if you got points for accumulating track penalties. I think we had about 47 minutes worth of penalties in Austria a couple of years back. So he'd for sure be the talent driver pick if that was the choice.
We could probably build that.
Yeah. I think I was on record last week as saying, like, don't touch Alpine. They're irrelevant. I don't care about them at all. That was another great take from yours truly. I'm probably staying away from them again this week. Do with that what you will based on my track record with Alpine, but I think they might be a little overvalued at this point. It's hard to buy a team after their best result of the season. So I might be giving that another week just to let that marinate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the question. Is if you look at who is ahead of Alpine at this point, they're going to have to bring some serious upgrades or something to continue to move up the leaderboard. Maybe with the exception of they have Nico Hülkenberg mixed in between the two of them, but I think like the likelihood that they start to consistently outperform Aston Martin, maybe the most realistic of the top 4 teams on the 5 teams in the top 10, but McLaren, Mercedes, Ferrari, Red Bull, probably unlikely, to Ryan's point, that you're going to continue to see them rise.
Yeah. So I think Alpine is probably the 6th best team, maybe the 5th best team at most tracks, not Austria. Here's why. That Renault power unit is probably the slowest of the 4 manufacturers, and Austria is a horsepower track. So I am less inclined to jump on the Alpine train at this particular weekend. That said, I had Ocon talent driver last week. He might end up being my talent driver this week. I wish I had fully committed to Alpine last week, actually. We'll have some points on the table that way. So we'll see what the one practice looks like. Again, sprint weekend, just one practice. But I'm not sure that Alpine's going to have a great weekend this weekend, but down the road, absolutely. I think they're faster than Williams. They're faster than Sauber. They're faster than Haas. Mm-hmm. They're maybe faster than Racing Bulls at this point. And Aston seems to have slid down the last couple races. We'll see if that continues or not. But Aston's looking vulnerable now as well. So, yeah, I think Alpine is legit at most tracks, but not Austria, probably not Monza once we get to the fall. Like their power unit's still going to be slow there. Mm-hmm. So those are my thoughts there.
Well, one counterpoint, William. What's your thoughts on qualifying position importance in Austria?
Okay, so this is F1. Qualifying position always matters a great deal, I think. So yeah, I think you got to qualify well, but even in the race, you got to have the power down the straights. Otherwise, you get eaten alive, especially with DRS being a thing. The one twist though, weather is a question mark yet again. This is like the 3rd weekend in a row where we're talking about the weather, and if the track is wet, then horsepower won't be such an impediment. So yeah, that's the other variable this weekend, and the safety cars it'll cause.
Yeah,
and no DRS probably.
Yeah,
that too. No DRS on a wet racetrack. I
see 2 questions. Well, Anthrax, how did you come to the decision of Ocon, Gasly, Alpine, and then Jake? Same question as Anthrax. I'm assuming it was the same question, unless I missed another Anthrax question. The answer was practice. So practice showed us some interesting takeaways. So sometimes players and even ourselves can get too caught up in practice results, and practice does not really correlate to the race. But if you're seeing consistency throughout the practice sessions, specifically FP2 and FP3, when FP2 is typically at the same time as the race, FP3 they're typically running lighter fuel loads, higher engine programs to try and get closer to race pace and get closer to qualifying. So during practice specifically for the Spanish GP, Alpine was holding up well, and Tsunoda and Stroll weren't. So I had Tsunoda and Stroll on my lineup. I did not have faith in their ability to kind of just jump so much from where they were in practice. So I paid the drop fee for Tsunoda and Stroll to pick up Gasly and Ocon. And I did the same thing with George Russell and Lewis Hamilton. I didn't, on this lineup specifically, I only ran Russell. I didn't run Hamilton, but on my other lineups, I ran Ocon, Gasly, Alpine, Russell, Hamilton. So I had some good moves this week.
And that I will say that advice probably not important this week with one practice session, and good luck deciphering that.
Yeah, there was a question
awesome
about
sprint
that.
weekends.
There's a question about that. The thing with the one practice is you'll have drivers on entirely different programs, even within the same team. So I'm looking more broadly at like what teams are at the top more than what drivers. Because like you may have one driver that's running qualifying laps and one driver that's not, for example. And you don't get a whole lot of data on race trim necessarily if you're just looking at fastness times. So yeah, sprint weekends are a lot trickier that way.
Russ, you muted?
Yeah, sorry,
Yes, he's
I am muted.
Yeah.
I was bringing up the next discussion point, which was, is it time to get back on the Lance Stroller coaster? If you look at his salary, very much, we are descending. We're on the drop. So the question is always, we're down. He's 1.4, but he's down to 13.5. And if you look at this chart, probably pretty close to his average for the season. His peak was last race at 14.9. His floor, and he's been down there a couple times, is about just under 12. So coming into this race is if you're riding the Lance Stroller coaster, is now a bye week. Is it a one or two race contract to get him on the team? Maybe make some quick value.
It's like the hesitation. It's funny. The hesitation isn't even mostly with Stroll. It's kind of like Aston as a whole doesn't look that great. Because it was before. It was like, is Stroll going to crash? What's Stroll going to do? But he has a pretty good car. Alonso is performing. Now it's kind of like you add another question to the mix, which, I mean, Lance Stroll's already a huge question to begin with, and I don't know if I want to mess with that with what Aston has shown recently. So we'll see what practice looks like, but yeah, I might be staying away from Stroll this weekend.
Agreed. Like his decline was not because he ran into something. It's because they got caught. Look at Alonso. Like Aston got caught. Alpine caught them.
Yeah.
Like I said before, though, that Mercedes power might buy them a couple of spots this week because the Mercedes is probably the fastest of the 4 power units. But I think Aston has legit been caught at this point.
If you're thinking of riding the stroller coaster, which I love that term, Ross. I never heard that one before. He's 13.5 and Yuki's 13.4. If that's my kind of budget, Yuki just had 2 bad races in a row. I would be more willing to put the chips in on Yuki than I would Lance right now. But that's it's also tough to call Yuki a value though right now. I don't want to skip ahead, but there are some.
Well, it's a good segue
there.
to the next question, which was the topic of Yuki. Yuki down 2 million, and just looking at salary charts, second week in a row of a drop. Close-ish to his. He's still above. Actually, he's probably a little bit below his season average in terms of salary. William, I think you've been very pro Yuki most of the season. Do you have any thoughts?
A lot of the season I have. I think Racing Bulls is sort of in that same boat where Alpine's caught up to them. Again, that said, though, the Honda's faster than the Renault. So this weekend, I think Yuki is still a viable choice. We'll see if the practice times back up that statement or not. But if we're talking about best of the rest, like best that's not in a top 4 constructor, I think at this point you've got Alonso, Yuki, and Gasly in some order. And I think this weekend's the pecking order is probably Yuki, Alonso, Gasly. If I had to take a guess, so like I think he is viable this weekend, but like I'm not really loving it going forward unless the team brings some upgrades to keep up with their rivals because yeah, they're looking beatable now.
Only other kind of discussion point I had, and then curious if you guys have anything that you want to chat through, is there's really just not a lot in the top 10, in my opinion, of opportunity. I mean, we talked about Perez, but the one I did think was at least worth discussing, just because, I think anytime I see a drop of close to $1 million in the top 10, you kind of wonder, it's a good opportunity to pick somebody up. So, Piastri, down 1.7 after last weekend, 23.2. He has a 8 race average points higher than the driver, both than Lewis Hamilton in 6th and now George Russell in 4th, who's $2 million more in cost. Is now time to consider Piastri.
Piastri is a hold for me. I'm not running to buy him. I'm not like, I still have him for one more race on my team. I'm just going to keep him there. I guess we'll just, because that gives me this week and then the cool down week to kind of see what's going on there. It's clear, like the McLaren car is clearly a rocket ship at this point, which has been a little disappointing to see what Piastri did the last couple of weeks. I mean, Norris is clearly proving that he looks pretty good. And I know Piastri just got all those same upgrades that Norris has had for a little bit now. So I'm kind of locked in on Piastri. I would say he's closer to a buy than a sell. But at this point, I'm just holding him.
Cool.
And I like Hamilton slightly better, like given that Mercedes has been improving.
Right.
That said, like if we're talking about Hamilton, Piastri, Checo, like all in that same neighborhood price wise, like we know Checo has the higher ceiling in terms of car pace. Piastri, for whatever reason, has just not kept up with his teammate really at any point, which is kind of unfortunate. I think the real question mark, like in that entire area of the grid, is Ferrari actually. Like Ferrari struggled the last couple races. Canada, I gave them the benefit of the doubt because of the weather. Maybe they did something different with the setup. They just straight up got beat last week. They looked bad last week. And if Ferrari continues looking bad, I think Piastri becomes a much more viable pickup.
There was a question in the chat: will Mercedes continue to perform as a constructor? Which, William, I think it goes with your comment of the Mercedes powertrain, at least for this next race.
Yeah, I like the Mercedes power at Austria, and I do think that Mercedes could get both of their cars in the top 5. I think their ceiling is probably podium, like 3rd place or so. Like we saw with Russell last week, where he was able to jump both the front row cars on the start. He jumped them both, but he couldn't hold. Like Verstappen caught him, Verstappen DRS'd him, and then Verstappen was out of DRS range almost immediately. And then Norris swallowed him up shortly after that. So yeah, I think the ceiling's like 3rd and 4th for Mercedes, but I do think they'll keep performing. I think we can expect them to be finishing top 5, especially if Ferrari is going to continue struggling.
Yeah, my only caution with Mercedes to anyone who's like looking to move to them, it's a points play, not a value play. So just keep that in mind. Their current value is 24.8 million. So for them to kind of keep that value, they have to be finishing fantasy rank 3rd as a constructor, because that salary is 24.4 million. So if Ferrari has a good race and Mercedes is then 4th, they're going to lose value. If they're able to hold their position at 3rd, they're not going to gain value. And it's probably a stretch to think that Red Bull, they're going to be able to jump Red Bull or McLaren. But if you do believe that, they will gain a little bit of value. So just disclaimer, Mercedes as a constructor right now is a points play, not a value play.
Question from Jake Adams: do you guys make decisions, especially with one practice sprint weekend, based off upgrades and or component replacements? If so, any thoughts, insights on this weekend? I certainly don't. I know that maybe one of the three of you at least probably is paying closer attention to that. So if you have any insights you give Jake, we'd love to hear them.
Williams brought a bunch of upgrades last week. We saw how that worked out.
Especially with these sprint weekends with one practice session, if you can decipher it, like, more power to you. I feel like I have trouble really figuring out, with everyone running different components. And I mean, I'm in mountain time zone, so I'll be watching this at 4:30 in the morning. My brain won't be firing at full capacity, so I'll be trying to do the math. It'll be like that meme with the numbers all around my head. So I probably will just get it wrong anyway, but I will be watching. I will be trying to figure it out, but I do not know if I will be able to.
Mm-hmm. And also, like, there's like a misnomer with upgrades. It's like, they're not upgrades until they're proven. Until then, they're just changes. Like, if you make a heavy car lighter, you're going to assume, oh, the car is going to be faster. But now what happens to the balance of that car, the ability to rotate the car, the tire degradation of that car? Like, these things are incredibly complex. So, when they're talking about upgrades, they're upgrades in theory because they happen in a wind tunnel and a simulation. Doesn't mean anything until it actually produces results on the track. And you see sometimes upgrades don't do anything. Sometimes upgrades send them backwards, and sometimes upgrades are actually huge. And we don't work with the same amount of information on a sprint weekend as we would in a normal weekend with three free practice sessions before quali. So you're going to be flying in a little blind. I just personally don't try not to get too hyped up into the upgrades announcements until we see some results of what those upgrades are. I've been burned by that before in the game.
I will say, I think my favorite time to kind of like handicap based on upgrades is when you have seen them proven, like with McLaren in the past. Like, you saw what Lando was able to do when he got that upgrade package, and then it came out a couple weeks later that Piastri was going to have the full package. So we saw that car in action. We saw what Lando did with it. So I was kind of all in on Piastri because I'm like, oh, these upgrades have been proven. Like, I've seen it with my own eyes, and you can see it on the timing screens and just with race pace. So those are my favorite ones to really take into account. But yeah, it can be tough, like what Mike said, when you haven't seen anything, and especially the teams are trying to figure out how it all works, and one practice session is detrimental to that.
Yeah. Question from Rick Wyke. He said, why is the total value of drivers increased since the beginning of the season? I didn't fully understand what that question meant. Rick, if you want to clarify, I'd be happy to answer it. But my recommendation would be go to support.gridrival.com and click the league section. There is an article, I believe, called F1 Salary Fluctuation Advanced, where we actually give the literal formula we use to fluctuate salaries. So if there's ever a question about, what you need to do, how you need to predict something in terms of driver salary, that is the best resource that we could give you.
I'll point out, like, the driver salaries are not a zero-sum situation.
Correct. Yeah, they all fluctuate independently of each other. So it's not as if there's, a total of 100 million that we have to use across all of the drivers to keep them even. Keep your questions coming in. Ryan, do you have any thoughts about Logan Sergeant coming into this weekend? What are you doing with Logan? He's on a continual downward spiral. I will say it's hard to get down to 3.5 million in this game in the middle of the season. So what's your plans?
That's a weird question to ask me. I'm notably part of the Max Verstappen fan club, as I root for winners over here. But no, I made 2 Logan predictions last week. I said that he would finish the race, so that's good. I also said he would not be the last classified finisher. He was. And also there were 0 DNFs. So 20 out of 20 is usually not the result you're looking for. I don't know. It's rough out there right now. We're trying to come up with any sort of spin zone we can. And I think we've landed on, look at what Albon did. Clearly this is the car. It's not really a driver situation. If Albon goes out there, finishes in the points, and Logan's 20th, then yeah, I'm a little concerned. But right now, it's like Albon's bad, Sargent was bad, so it's clearly the car. They need to get into the garage, get these things fixed up in the factory, give Logan something that he can really succeed in, because I really want to see his talents come to the forefront. And unfortunately, we may have to be watching IndyCar races next year in order to watch Sargent. So
if he's lucky.
if he's okay. Anyways, I do. All that being said, and actually a serious light, he's down at 3.5. As William has said, this is a high horsepower track. Williams should be able to be a little bit better here. I don't know how good, but they should be better here than maybe that salary indicates. So if you're brave and bold, I think this is the time to really bring Logan into your lineup at an extremely cheap price play. That's actually what I will be doing. So Logan Sergeant will be on the roster this weekend. We'll see how it goes. I mean, part of that is just because I don't have much money left over for my last driver. But anyways, like, I love Logan Sergeant. We'll see how it goes. Hopefully he has some room to grow through. It's hard to go down from there. Just keep finishing races, and maybe we just got to hope other people DNF at this point. But yeah, we'll see what happens. But overall, very not good.
Yep.
Maybe we get some rain on Sunday.
Go ahead, William. Sorry.
I see somebody asking if
I have a Logan thing though. Are you changing away from Logan?
I'm going to tie it in, actually. If somebody was asking me if Haas is the better choice sub 10 million based on engine performance, I'm actually slightly preferring the Mercedes power this weekend. So you could take a flyer on Sargent. Like, it's going to be hard to get any worse than where we're at now. So yeah, like, if Williams is like not last in practice, you could go that route. Like, you go Williams, you could go one of their drivers, probably not both of their drivers. Like, I wouldn't suggest that. I would even say, like, if we're talking constructors, so maybe Haas is probably slightly better than Sauber at this point, but like, Haas is like one good driver, one bad driver. We've been talking about horsepower. Like, tell me if you find a good source of horsepower stats. The teams aren't volunteering that data. You've just got to look at how the cars are performing on this type of track traditionally, on tracks with long straights. Like where do you see them gaining ground, losing ground? So it's partial information for all of us. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be like this for a while. The power units, as far as I know, are fairly frozen development-wise until the 2026 rule package. So what you see now is probably how it's going to be for the next year and a half.
Yeah. Okay. I made this point last week, and I'll make it again this week. Logan Sergeant is 3.5 million. He completed the Spanish GP and scored 67 points. Logan Sergeant is the cheapest way to get that amount of points. There's no driver difference in the game. That's a $3.5 million difference that will net you 67 points. There's to be able to get a meaningful amount of points more than 67, you have to be spending way more than double. So I'm not recommending Logan Sergeant as like a good pick. It's more of a lineup strategy. It's a sprint weekend. There's extra points for the sprint race. This is a weekend to go top heavy. So if you have you could put Logan Sergeant in your lineup for $3.5 million. Just cross your fingers that he finishes all the events, and he'll generate the most amount of points relative to his cost, and that'll give you a lot more headroom to be able to have more blue chip drivers or more high end midfielders than you would if you were to say, oh, I don't believe in Sargent at all. I'm going to run K-Mag, who scored 15 points more for more than double the cost. To me, I could totally appreciate someone putting Logan on their lineup to run a top-heavy roster, especially for a sprint weekend. He's going to cross his fingers he finishes.
Logan's value index score is 23.3, which is double the person Kevin Magnussen ahead of him at 12. So to your point, and for those of you who don't know, value index is just a measurement of their salary relative to their average points they've earned over the last 8 events. And the higher you go up the field, the lower that gets. Like, Verstappen's at 5.2. So that gives you an idea of how many points he's going to earn you relative to how much he's going to cost you. 23 is a number that you really don't see very, very often. So that is actually a really, really good point. I think you're going to see high. I would actually guess you're going to see really high league adoption across the whole game for him, just because people that are short money. I think, Ryan, you said you're in that position, right? Sometimes he's the only spot that you can fill if you stack your roster.
But even if you have 130, 140 million, if you put Logan Sargent in, you could basically have the top 3 drivers. You know,
Yeah.
like it's
Yeah. Top 4, because you have the top 3, and then Logan's probably the 4th best. So there you go. That's the maximum efficiency play here. Like maybe it's exploiting the game a little bit. So don't tell anyone if you're in the YouTube chat listening to this. But yeah, adopt him. Get a head up on your league mates. We'll call it the Logan loophole. We'll figure something out. See, the spin zones just create themselves as we go. So there we go. We figured out the whole Logan Sergeant dilemma, and we've landed on he is the best value and best guy you want on your team. And I hope someone from Williams is listening to this, and we'll just give him a contract extension, because we need him for our game. We need him for our show. We need him for content. So if anyone out there has a connection to the Williams team, like, send them this clip.
He doesn't crash as much as Albon, and when he crashes, he doesn't crash as hard.
Ah,
In our
softer
cost
cracks.
cap era, that matters.
Yeah, he doesn't ruin cars like Albon does. Get rid of Albon.
Where would you? How long of a contract would you be signing Logan to if you were his team manager? Ryan.
I mean,
Real answer. The real answer.
The real answer? Well, the real answer, like, don't tell anyone I said this. The real answer is 0. They should definitely not re-sign him. But I think if you're saying you have to, as short as possible.
I mean, when does Antonelli turn 18?
Well, they're changing the rules for him,
August.
aren't they?
Yeah,
Did that get vetoed?
No, it went through.
Oh, it did? Okay.
Yeah, it did go through, and he turns 18 in August.
I still want to see him get a podium in F2, but Prima is not such a great team this year, so
yeah,
not sure that'll be happening.
Ooh, also,
but yeah, like, it wouldn't surprise me if Sargent's a summer break replacement. And as far as I know, he's not a paid driver. Somebody just asked that in the chat.
Yeah,
but I don't know. Yeah, I don't think so.
I see the Toaster Boy comment about teammate points. That's another great thing. I just talked about how bad Albon has been. Sargent's going to score some teammate points here. When you look at, like, Albon might crash out. Albon doesn't look as good. Maybe Sargent scores. Maybe Sargent out qualifies Albon for the first time ever. Maybe.
I don't know. I think you're getting ambitious. I think you need to really. I think you really need to help our audience understand, when you're being serious, when you're joking, because I've lost. I don't know where we're at on the continuum here.
I get that a lot.
Yeah. I'm all in on the value index play. Beating teammates points. I don't know if I'm there yet. I don't know if you're there. I don't know if you're really there. Are you really there?
There's got to be people, like, everyone here is an F1 fan that consumes a lot of F1 content. Where else are you going to go for like 10 straight minutes of Logan Sargent talk, which maybe is a little too much, but you got to give the people, like, there's a lot of Logan Sargent questions.
It's true.
They're not getting this content anywhere else. You got people talking about, Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, all these cars at the front. Like, we got to show some love to the whole grid. So look at that.
That's the great thing about our game, by the way. The entire grid matters.
Yeah.
It's not just the Max and Lando worlds.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why I think fantasy in this sport makes it so much more exciting. Specifically in really in Formula One, since it's so predictable. But you actually have investment into
the midfield matters. Grid. Even the back of the grid matters here.
For sure. Jake Adams says, would you all agree that the best cars in this order are Red Bull, McLaren, Mercedes, Ferrari, Aston? The only thing I would think would maybe I would want to investigate more would be Mercedes and Ferrari.
Yeah.
But outside of that.
Right now it's looking that way.
Yeah, and I feel like Red Bull's edge over McLaren is the smallest it's ever been.
It is
think
small.
Alpine, I'm sorry, I think Alpine's caught up with Aston on most tracks. Go ahead.
I will say too, I know we've talked about constructors not being as valuable on sprint weekends, so that's the one thing that's giving me some hesitation. If this was not a sprint weekend, like, Red Bull as a constructor is, I think, a great signing, especially because I'm high on Checo this week. I think Max wins. I think Checo has a good showing. And the fact that Red Bull's cheaper than McLaren and just barely above Mercedes. Again, I still got to figure out what I'm going to do there, just because it is a sprint weekend and you should be weighing drivers a little more heavily. But if this was not, then I think Red Bull would be a top play for constructor.
Do you think they cut Checo somehow mid-season? Not possible.
Maybe this offseason he retires. And Red Bull is known for not necessarily honoring things with drivers.
Yeah.
But let's all consider who's in charge, and they're keeping Max happy. And Max wants team synergy. He wants a clear number 2 driver. Anyone else you put in the Red Bull number 2 seat is going to cause Max a headache. And they're putting all their chips in on Max. They just need Perez to do well enough to keep their world championship contention strong, which he should be able to do, just doesn't consistently do it. But who else could you put as a number 2 seat in the Red Bull car? I
think Red Bull's fortunate right now that Piastri is still kind of finishing in the same-ish zone, right? If Piastri starts consistently getting 3, 4, 5, then I think they might be a little bit more concerned, would be my guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let's see.
Lineup questions.
Cool.
I have 49.2 million and I need 2 drivers. Lewis and Oscar are locked. When you send these in, please tell us who else you have so we don't recommend someone you already have.
My first question is, do you have Sergeant?
Yeah.
Well, 49.2, you can do quite a bit.
You can.
So Lewis and Oscar are locked. So you could go like either Max or Norris, like who could like they'll probably top 2 the sprint and the race in some order, like Max and Norris. And then you still have like 18, 19 million, which will get you like that could get you Alonso, who's just a little bit too expensive for talent drivers, sadly. Or it could get you whatever midfielder you prefer. You could 49 million. You could go Russell Checo. That's kind of brave. Like going Checo is brave, but like that's a viable option. Yeah. So either top driver, midfielder, or like 2 top 5-ish drivers. Probably your choices there. And Russell has been beating Hamilton, so he could at least get you some teammate points. That said, Verstappen is the same deal. Like he's easily beating Checo every week.
And then do you need a talent driver too? Do you have a talent driver already set, or do you need one? Because if you need one, then it's pretty easy. It's like sign Max and sign whichever talent driver you like, and you'll have some money left over. But if you don't need a talent driver, then you can start looking at that, splitting 2 drivers at about that 23, 24 range. And I know we talked about Alonso again, just because he's so close to that talent driver range. I don't really want him on my roster until he hits that threshold. If he has a bad race and he goes under, then he is an immediate sign, an immediate talent driver selection. But until then, like, I don't think there's much point in signing him, because you're either going to lose out on that, he'll do, like, if he does poorly and he drops down there is when you want him, or you're just spending 18.1 for a guy who's going to probably finish 9th or 10th.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions coming in?
60.6 need 2 drivers, 1 constructor. They have Norris, have Piastri, have Sargent, have Hamilton. And Ricardo.
Or is Ricardo locked, or does he have Ricardo or Ferrari?
He's just saying those
Ferrari
are locked. Yeah.
Okay, so
60 point. Okay.
Yeah, I would say we're not thinking constructor in a sprint week, so we're probably looking at Williams or Sauber. Like if Williams is garbage in practice, then Sauber is a better pick. Otherwise, I like Williams better, and so that's 7.3. That leaves us 53.3. We need 2 drivers and constructor. It's just like our friends Astro with the 49.2. We can afford some top drivers here. So 53.3. I take Max at 30.9. So that's 23.4, I think. No, 22.4. And then 22.4. You could go Max Checo if you're going to go all in on Red Bull. Like that's an option. I'm not sure I like Leclerc because we've discussed how Ferraris may be falling down. So like Russell Piastri might be an option.
Yeah. What's standing out is his talent driver eligible right now is Sargent and Ricardo. So to
Yeah,
me, he doesn't have a good talent driver selection right now. So
yeah.
I would
Yeah,
go.
Max and a talent driver.
So is that?
Max and a talent driver then.
Yeah, you need max and a talent driver. Then when you have what you have left over is what you pay the most amount for your constructor, so that you just use your bank to get as many points as possible. So your talent drivers for this weekend, you're going to be looking at Alpine. Sonoda could be a value, but little gamble there. Haas has the Ferrari powertrain, so Hulkenberg is also an option. So you basically just have to pick your talent driver, and then you get max. Then whatever's left over is your constructor, and that's how you solve that problem.
Someone asking, how have we proven that the drivers matter more on sprint weekends? It's simple, actually. So the way our point system works, the only difference between a sprint weekend and a not sprint weekend is that drivers score points based on their sprint position. It's extra points. Constructors don't score sprint points. Their points are just like any other week. For the drivers, we add sprint points as a new category, and everything else stays the same. So drivers will score more points. You will score at least one more point as long as you don't get disqualified or not start the sprint, actually. Like you could finish last and you still get a point.
Mm-hmm.
You win,
And
you get 20 points.
And there's no points for sprint shootout. That's just for the grid starting position for sprint. Points are awarded for the sprint finish position only.
Yeah, there's no overtakes, no teammate points or anything like that. We do lock on sprint shootouts. So we are locking on Friday, early Friday, Eastern time for those of you unaware of how sprints work here.
Jake says, "Can I be your components guy? Upgrades, horsepower, torque, tech stats guy?" Yeah, absolutely. Maybe. I'll just say maybe. Shoot us an email. You can email me directly, ross@gridrival.com. Be happy to chat about it. Best talent driver picks this week. That's a great question. We haven't even talked about talent drivers yet. I mean, there's only a couple obvious options, I think. Let's look at who's under the threshold. So we have, hold on. I got to get to the right screen here.
Gasly, Hulk,
There you go.
Ocon, Stroll, Sonoda, Ricardo, Zhou, Albon, Bottas, Magnussen, Sargent are your talent eligible
So
drivers. This week.
Yuki has your highest average points per race. I think the question is, can he maintain that? He has, 4 drivers ahead of him in terms of cost.
They were slow last week. That's my hesitation with Racing Bulls. Like
And you're bearish on Alpine at this track, if I remember right.
That's right. I was like, Alpine's one of the teams that caught them. I don't know that Alpine's going to be able to keep that up this particular week.
Yeah.
So you might have a bargain with Sonoda. And then we also saw Aston looking slower. So we'll see if that continues. That said, the power unit may bail them out this week. So for me, talent driver is probably between Hulkenberg, Stroll, and Sonoda. And I'm probably thinking, like, without seeing practice times, that's always the caveat here. I'm probably thinking Hulk, Sonoda, Stroll in that order. I am thinking about the weather and, Stroll maybe running into things.
Mm-hmm. Very much. Let's see. Anyone ending contracts early? And in what situations might you recommend it? Is there anyone in the middle of a downward spiral that you should get out of?
I would end Alonso early for the same point I made earlier, just because you don't want to get, if you have like one race left on Alonso, you don't want to get locked out if he goes down and becomes talent driver eligible. And I just I don't think he's really that great a value where he is now. So I would end Alonso early if I had him on my team right now. And I think that's probably it.
And Ryan's point, by the way, is that, probably everybody knows that's listening at this point, when you drop a driver, you can't re-sign them for one race. But if you dropped him right now ahead of this weekend, you'd be able to pick him back up at the next race if he drops under that 18 million threshold.
If you give me an alternate plan that makes sense, I could consider dropping Leclerc, especially if practice continues to look bad for Ferrari. 2 weeks in a row, I'm starting to worry about Ferrari. And you've got Leclerc in third, and he may be overvalued.
Yeah, interesting.
Both Mercedes beat him last week.
Michael Toaster Boy said you consider dropping Gasly if you knew the tax. You can see it by just click on his name on your team if he's on your team. If he's not on your team, just go to if he's on your team, if you're considering dropping him, so just click on his name, and you'll see a drop down right there, and it'll say what his release fee is.
And it's
It's
486
of his current value.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
486,000, and it's 3% of the contract value universally, drivers and constructors. My pro tip for Toaster Boy, email support at GridRival.com. You might just be on an old app version or something. So send screenshots and they'll take a look. It should definitely be. I'm looking at it right now, so you might just be on an old app version. The 3% total. The number one piece of advice I can give for considering dropping a driver, I didn't listen to myself last weekend. If you think that the value drop is going to be greater than the drop fee, then you drop the driver, right? So I was considering dropping Leclerc. I had him on a contract, and I kind of got stuck into the whole, like, I'm not going to pay the drop fee. I don't want to lose all that amount of money. I think he's going to stay flat, neutral, or it just won't be enough. And I didn't. And probably not the best move. So if you think the drop fee is going to be less than what they're going to lose in the race, drop the driver. You're going to save yourself money in the long run.
Yep. And the other point about dropping drivers is do not do it until you've seen practice. There is no upside to dropping a driver before practice. You can only hurt yourself. So if you're gonna pay a fee, you might as well see that car on the track first.
And you can't undo paying a release fee. If you pay the release fee, it's done. So if you email support at GridRival.com, they can't help you. That is a game mechanic.
We will laugh at you.
Yeah.
Cool. I think we're through our topics list. So I think if anybody has any final Q&A, bring the questions. We got about 8 minutes left.
Yeah, real quick, there's a question about Gasly versus Ocon for talent driver. I'll say what I said last week, but take this with a grain of salt because I've had a blind spot on Alpine all year. I view them as exactly the same. So I would use the cheaper one, which is Ocon by a couple million.
I think Gasly's been consistently beating him. If we don't care about generating money, I like Gasly better because he's more likely to be the better of the two drivers and get you some teammate points in the process. That's my thought there. Jake asked if Ferrari's consistently top five there. So Ferrari's still top three constructor, even though I don't like Leclerc. That's because they've been top five. That's one of the reasons. The other is Red Bull only has one good driver. McLaren has one great driver and one fairly mediocre driver with Piastri. If either of these teams had two drivers that were podiuming every week, like Ferrari would be further down the order. Like Mercedes does seem to be catching Ferrari, and like Ferrari could end up fourth in the pecking order very soon, I think.
Andrew Rifle says, is there a web application that works? There's not. We had one in the past. It was used by a very small percentage of people and nowhere near relative to the amount of cost it took to keep it up. So it's not in the immediate plans. You're welcome to request the idea or promote it. We have live feedback boards, feedback.gridrival.com, where you can propose, features and ideas that you want. You can vote on other ones that people have included. So feel free to add that, or I'm sure it's probably already there. So go find it and upvote it. How many players overall on GridRival? Call it, close to 100,000 started the season, at least in the Formula One game. So if you're in the top 1,000, you're in the top 1%. Let's see. I said, someone had said wanting to do daily picks for the contest. We don't have the contest up yet, so we didn't prepare daily picks, Anrock. So check back next week. We'll have something up.
Yeah, if I am slapping together $100 million lineup, I'm probably looking at Mercedes drivers. Maybe not Alpine this week unless they're looking fast in practice. Like that's somewhere I'd look. Hulkenberg is somewhere I'd look. And so I'm probably looking at a bunch of mid-pack drivers, especially being a sprint. And I'm going cheaper on constructor, again, because of a sprint. That's my very quick thought. If I'm on a budget, more like 100 million.
Mercedes, Checo, and Sargent.
There you go.
Yep.
Yeah, I would agree with those ones. All right. Any final questions? Any thoughts you guys have going into the weekend?
I mean, Will Smith makes a good point. He says, what if his dog got his phone and released his driver? Does that change things? I think you probably want to get your dog his own phone and sign him up for GridRival.
Yeah.
He sounds like a smart dog, and we'd love to have another player. So
Yeah.
I think
Send
that's
a
the
picture of
solution there.
dog.
Yeah.
And a picture of the dog, yes.
Yeah. And
If you
and
send a
that
picture of a
comment-
dog, if you send a picture of a dog with your support request, we're more likely to side with you.
Yeah. And the dog ate my homework is a very common support request. You have to get a lot more creative to compete with the messages that come to support at gridrival.com. And
What are some of the top ones?
I would say my all-time favorite happened last season, and our support person sent it to me because she didn't know how to respond. Someone was extremely upset when Yuki's car died on the formation lap, and then he scored 0 points for the race. And he wrote a very long, very detailed reason of why Yuki should not drop in value because the car failed, not him. And he listed all of Yuki's accomplishments and of why he should not drop $2 million in value because the car died in the formation lap. So that's going to be one of my all times. And we're talking paragraphs.
Maybe we need to do a best of customer support email every year. Just share the best stories. All right. Any final thoughts from y'all before we close out the day?
I personally, just for my mental health and well-being, really need Logan Sergeant to not finish P20 again.
Yeah,
that's my only thought.
As long as a couple people crash, that will for sure happen. As long as he doesn't, so it's rain coming. Who knows what'll happen?
This will be an exciting weekend. It'll be interesting to see if Red Bull and McLaren continue to duke it out up front, or if one pulls ahead of the other. Yeah. And it'll be a really busy weekend all around the racing world. There's lots of other races to follow between F1, NASCAR, MotoGP, Formula E are the ones off the top of my head. And there is so much racing to watch this weekend, and that's always a great weekend.
And yeah, I wonder if maybe we'll get a weird grid. I know last year during qualifying, there were 6 million laps deleted. So maybe someone at the top isn't able to stay on the track, gets their lap deleted, doesn't make it into Q2, Q3, whatever it is. So we'll see if anything happens there.
Maybe the stewards snipe Alpine's time instead of Sargent's this time.
Maybe.
There's one more question that we could probably end on is rain performance. So my comment there is there's two things with rain performance that I consider if there's going to be rain in the schedule is one, driver experience. The more years that they've had in Formula One, the more chance they've been able to experience rain and perform in the rain. So that makes me lean towards driver experience. But the number one thing is pit wall strategy, because if you actually look at the rain races, the drivers and the teams that come out ahead are the ones that nail the strategy of the wets, the inters, and the slicks, and when to change to what as the conditions change, unless we're talking about just a full rain out where it's going to be inters or wets the whole time. So that makes me fade Ferrari.
Plan E, plan F, plan G.
Yeah. So that's how I think about rain performance.
All right, on that note,
Checo's
do you have something you want to say, William?
Checo's rookie year, he nearly won a wet weather race in a Sauber. He was one less mistake away from winning in a Sauber. That's how crazy these things can get.
Yeah, for sure. All right, on that note, we're going to end the show today. We thank you all for joining and for bringing the Q&A. We look forward to an exciting race weekend, and we will talk to you all here in a few weeks. Thanks for joining.